Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with all of you. I really want to salute Montgomery Moving Forward for bringing together such a terrific group here, which really represents all sectors. We have people from government, we have people from the nonprofit and philanthropy sectors, we have people from education, we have people representing business, and we have people that represent just people from neighborhoods. And this panel that we have right now really represents this cross-sector perspective. I'm going to be doing two panels back to back. This first panel sort of laying out some of the issues, and then a second panel where we're going to be responding and actually taking it further towards the call to action. And all of you have the call to action here, so I want you to be thinking as you listen to this panel and the next one, and then hear from our school superintendent sort of what you could be doing from your own particular perspective to move this agenda forward. You've heard all of our panelists, and if you look in your program, you're going to see more about their background. But as I mentioned, they represent sort of you here in the room. They have particular expertise. Jennifer Lockwood-Shabat really brings that perspective of a foundation that is funding a lot of these early childhood programs that help and enable working women in our county and girls to actually succeed. Miriam Calderon has the distinction of getting President Obama in his State of the Union to actually say, we need universal pre-K. So she comes from that perspective. She was ready to get Hillary Clinton moving forward with her early childhood education in transition, and she's now doubling down to make sure that this agenda goes forward. And then Uma actually brings that perspective of government, but also human services and sort of what is within the realm of things actually being possible within the budget constraints and sort of what we have for funding all of these programs. And then Manny brings that workforce perspective, somebody who, from a human resource perspective, actually knows what it takes to have somebody who is ready to move into a job and advances towards that prosperity agenda, the economic imperative that we're talking about today. So we're going to bounce around. We're going to keep answers very short because we have a lot to cover here. And if there are some really burning questions, I'm happy even to take some questions from the audience here. And we'll try to work through that as well. So let me just start, if I can. Nancy Navarro talked about the changing demographics of this county, sort of a new face for Montgomery County, and sort of what we need to do to take that into consideration as we think about a future agenda. So if I could start with you, Uma, and just talk about how the changing demographics of the early childhood cohort in this county, where you have more children between kindergarten and fourth grade who speak Spanish in the home as their first language than children who speak English. How do we need to take that into consideration in terms of the framework for what we're going to be building going forward?
So we have lots of conversation in our county about the educational achievement gap and how early does it start. Going even before that, I firmly believe that early education and health interventions can actually disrupt the cycle of poverty. And if we're really, really serious about economic development, economic empowerment, then we need to make sure that, I think it was really interesting when Mike Chesser talked about equity versus equality, and that's where we need to go. It's not just enough to make opportunity available. Access is important, but if people don't have the opportunity to take advantage of it and have the financial means to take advantage of it, then their children are going to be left behind, and that is something we must guard against. And that's what you see with the disparities in the population with the demographic shifts.
So an achievement gap often and usually leads to the opportunity gap. Manny, you see it from the perspective of an employer being at Holy Cross Hospital. Tell us what you see in this county as a changing demographic imperative that we have to consider as we look at the start of life and to that moment when people are looking for employment and building their own families and future.
I used to be at Holy Cross Health, which is marvelous, by the way. You plug into Holy Cross for being a marvelous employer and an unbelievable commitment to actually paying a living wage that actually makes it possible for people to access things that would otherwise be impossible. You know, Holy Cross started just earlier in the year a commitment to actually pay each one of its employees at least $15 an hour. That's a big commitment for a hospital in this county, considering the reimbursement issues that we all know are going on in the state. That said, I've moved on to a different venerable employer that started its work with the aged and the orphans. So our history at Asbury Communities is a little bit different, but just as committed in terms of our commitment to those who are young and who need help. The truth is that the achievement gap and how it shows up in the workforce is really interesting. First, let me make one correction. I think earlier we said that the workforce of the future are millennials. At Asbury Communities, the workforce of today are over 50% millennials. Mm-hmm. So it's not the workforce of the future. The workforce of the future are the Generation Z, or the founders, as we call them now, which are just about to enter the workforce, that are even more diverse than millennials in many cases, and who are bringing these same issues of lack of English proficiency to the workforce of today, and are raising children by virtue of the fact that they are entering reproductive age that are also of limited English proficiency. The urgency is that, within the next 15 years, they'll be serving the residents of the communities we serve. I mean, that's how close we are to having yet another generation coming in. The millennials are sort of baked. And I adore them for their impetus in technology and for being the most diverse working population we have. But we have a generation coming up that has just the same amount of needs, and where we can actually make a difference by providing the services and the commitment so that their children will have a good start and be appropriate contributors to the community we serve.
So, Miriam, let me jump to you, because in your new role at the Bainum Foundation, you are investing in this early care and childhood education. As you look at Montgomery County, what do you see that is working? And from your expertise and sort of broader view, looking across this country, working with President Obama in the White House, what do you see as gaps that that we should be looking at here in Montgomery County?
Absolutely. And is it okay, I just want to comment also on the demographic piece, just to close a loop on that. I think that the implications of the changing demographics are really to think about, if these programs don't work for the children and families that we're talking about in these shifts, and then our systems, our programs, and our policies don't work at all. I mean, I think that sounds very trite and really simple, but we're doing a lot in this county, I think led by a lot of the efforts at the state level through programs like Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge, to build systems of early learning, to define standards for programs and requirements, to define competencies and knowledge and skills of our early childhood educators, to say who is qualified to teach, what should they know and be able to do, and to what extent do those new systems, policy structures reflect what we know is effective for these children and families and communities. And I think this takes almost a forensic analysis of, and really deep dive look at, if we're not assessing in children's home language as they enter kindergarten for what they know and are able to do, if we're not thinking about the knowledge and skills that teachers need to have to be able to work with diverse children and families, if we're not preparing teachers to deal with race and equity issues and anti-bias, then we don't have systems and programs, and they won't produce the outcomes that we know are possible. So I really challenge us to think about that as we go forward in the plan. Strengths of Montgomery County, I see that there is tremendous momentum at the local level across the country, and leadership at the local level matters. I think the implications of the election make that even more possible as we go into some uncertainty around what will happen with these federal programs. I kind of I'll tell this sort of quick story. When I was working on the president's proposal for universal pre-K, we were very much focused on the states and how can we engage governors. And my boss, who's President Obama's education advisor, Roberto Rodriguez, wisely said, we should really focus on mayors. And I was like, really? No, governors. That's why he's where he is, and advising the president. And it's been tremendous to see counties, cities really step up to the plate and and say, we need to raise more dollars. What can we do locally? How do we think about addressing some of these challenges and really build local systems that are connected to state systems? And so when I look at Montgomery County, I think there's great leadership here. We have a school system that has been running Head Start programs and investing in pre-K for a very long time. We have county leaders in health and human services that have been putting dollars into, supporting the workforce, into helping make early care and education programs more affordable. We've had investments in creating exemplary programs, 2-generation programs that serve children from birth or prenatally through age 5. So I think that's the important place to start. Where this really takes off, I think, in communities is when cross-sector leaders come together. They're willing to look at investments. They're really willing to look at shared outcomes. They're willing to look at things differently and sort of build on where they are. And I think there's a lot to build on. I do believe that we also, though, and I think these are lessons from around the country, need to think about the system that we build here connected to the state system. And, as I've looked at where we are in Montgomery County, I think a lot about what the state has been doing and what the leadership has been here. And I think that there's these partnerships really need to be better solidified because the county is doing a lot in early care and education, and so is the state. When you have 3 pre-K programs or 4, I'm not sure how many we have here, but in Montgomery County with different eligibility requirements, funding streams, experiences for, whether it's full day or part day, you've got to think, we've got to work together with the state to make this more simple and less complex for families.
Thank you so much. As an education reporter for Channel 7 for many, many years, I actually had a chance to follow the very first class of children in DC who started in pre-K. My son was in that class and was at one of the DC elementary schools. We followed that very diverse class all the way through 12th grade and showed tremendous outcomes. As a result, DC has universal pre-K. So I want to kind of pick up that item and maybe have the superintendent address that issue of universal pre-K potentially as a new economic imperative that we should be thinking about here in Montgomery County. But I want to ask Jennifer right now, you see and invest in a lot of programs that you see delivering results. That's what the Women's Foundation is looking for, programs that are working. Give me some examples of things in your own experience that you think are also working for early care and childhood education here in Montgomery County.
Happy to do so. I also want to pick up on the changing demographics for 2 seconds and just echo a couple of things that my fellow panelists said, and that it really is about multiple generations, which I think sort of came up here. We're focused on and talking about our youngest at the earliest ages, but they're being cared for by individuals that are all different ages. And so our family structures are very different. We have grandmothers raising grandchildren. And so when the Women's Foundation did analysis of the American Community Survey data that came out earlier this fall on poverty, and Montgomery County was the only jurisdiction in this region that the number of women living in poverty actually increased. And so that impacts the children. And so I think to everyone's point, and sort of Uma saying, how do you disrupt the cycle? There is a multi-generational perspective to that has to be taken into account. To your question about the Women's Foundation and sort of where we invest and how we think about investments and outcomes, in the early care and education space specifically, we've been very focused on systems change, to the point of what Miriam just said. What are the policies and practices that need to happen in order to increase quality, increase access, increase affordability? And so we house an early care and education funders collaborative, which is a group of funders. It's corporate philanthropy, it's private foundations, family foundations, all coming together and pooling their resources to invest in systems change that can happen throughout our community in order to increase access, quality, and affordability.
So let's talk about the resources and the policy changes. If I can jump back to you, Uma, as you take a look at sort of the future agenda, what would be in your ideal state, the things that you could see investing in that you think we need to build this economic imperative for here in the county?
So I have no funding limits in this vision, right?
Right.
I hope the policymakers
Blue
are
sky it,
listening,
and then
right?
we'll bring it back to
right,
reality.
Right, we can do that. So whenever we talk about early childhood in our community, and we've been really focused on this for several years, and acknowledging Nancy Navarro and Hans Riemer over here and my county executive who's not over here. I think they've been extraordinarily focused and pushing this agenda of early childhood, accessibility, affordability, quality enhancements, and workforce. I mean, if you want to think about it, there are these 4 pillars. We have to make investments in all of these. Accessibility is a huge issue, and it's really tied to affordability. Affordability then impacts quality. You know, what can you afford? What's the level? And then this issue of compensation for workforce then is impacted by quality. So they're all interrelated, and each of them requires investments in their own right. If you were to do it right, we would invest in all 4 in very strategic ways. And the county's actually been working on a strategic plan that's due out in a few weeks that we believe will lay some of that blueprint out as to where should the investments be. We obviously cannot do all of it all at once, and so there will be choices we would need to make, and how strategically we make those choices will often determine sort of how do you layer the investments over time, right? This is not something we're going to catch in one bite. So the other piece I would say is as we think about investment, our partnership with the school system is incredibly valuable because it builds. You can lose a lot of gains by 3rd grade if you don't continue to sustain them on an ongoing basis. And so that then, there is the 0 to 5, and then there is the 5 to 8, and then the 8 and above, and then you think about transition age youth. And so that you keep building on it. And I think Mr. Leggett said something that's really powerful. If you don't think about housing and transportation in conjunction with, and workforce development in conjunction with what we're doing, it gets lopsided, and you can't get to a good policy frame. So I think all of that has to play in terms of what we're going to do.
Manny, what from your perspective would be the policy changes or the sort of the investments that would have the best ROI?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I mean, a part of it is to piggyback on the multi-generational theme that my fellow panelists brought up. I think we need to make it easier to actually have the exchange of ideas between generations. Elder people are not outside of the economic sphere. They can contribute. And in Montgomery County, the demographics of those who are senior to us are quite favorable. They are unbelievably educated, and they are vital. They're seeking things to do with commitment and have a natural commitment to those who are younger and perhaps a little bit less fortunate. So motivating those in situations that may be helpful and policies that actually foster that is actually something that we should look into. The ideas that happen to cross generations, the proficiency that the elders in this county have with the language of instruction and of speech that the newcomers don't have. And the contributions, the multicultural contributions and the vitality that the exchange brings is something we should explore very carefully and make policies that make those exchanges possible.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to build on that because you're preaching to the choir here as one of your elders. At a period of my life of transition, I was motivated to start volunteering at Oakview Elementary School in Silver Spring, which is a Title I school where the largest cohort of students do not speak English as the first language in the home. And I'm tutoring a 3rd grader who's from El Salvador and a 4th grader who is from Ethiopia. There are other men and women my age that are in that school through a very informal program. But I have researched this and seen that while DC has a program through the National Volunteer Corporation, a federal program, and AARP, as does many other places around the country, Montgomery doesn't have that kind of a former senior corps of volunteers in the schools. And so as a call to action for me, that's an idea that I'd like to see socialized more of how you get people who are about to retire, thinking of retiring, looking for meaningful work to become a real experience corps working in our schools and with the early childhood education cohort. Is this something that you think on a local level, but potentially scaling is one solution we should be looking at?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And tell me what you see as the benefit of something like that.
Well, I think, as we think about these opportunity gaps and because this is really what we're talking about. I think we're talking about closing opportunity gaps precisely in the first most critical period in human development in these first 5 years of life. And so we need to think outside of the box. We need to think about all of the available resources in the community. There is no one system, one policy, one initiative, one funding stream that is going to close an opportunity gap, this opportunity gap and deliver children ready for school. It is a system. When I met with Sharon sort of early on and thinking about this event today, I whipped out the ovals. Who's familiar with the ovals here? This early childhood systems ovals, right? So when I'm talking about, this is, when I think about where the county needs to invest, I think we have an early learning system that is complicated, that is underfunded, that, that doesn't have the coherence that it needs for any of these other systems and sectors to be able to coordinate and integrate with it. And I think when what we're talking about building here is really a early learning system that meets the needs of our children and families in this county. And that's going to require investments. That's going to require working with the state. That's going to require hard choices and thinking outside of the box around new programs. That alone, a child care provider alone, is not going to close the opportunity gap. Mm-hmm. We need then a system that early learning system to be connected with family support, to be connected with the healthcare system. If you want to think about making an impact in the first 1,000 days for infants and toddlers, you have to think about the health system. That is the population-based approach to reaching all of our infants and toddlers in the city. And so what if the health system embrace the same developmental science that early learning does? What would the pediatrician's visit look like, right? Would there be developmental screening? Would we be as focused on language development and social emotional development and cognitive development as we are on height and weight? Absolutely. What if the transportation system felt an imperative, right, to support school readiness and to support early learning? So when you start talking about, we've talked a lot about business, we all have a role to play. So I think as we go forward, let's think about what that coherent, cohesive early learning system needs to look like to meet our needs, and then how are we really ensuring cross-sector leadership, new ideas, new innovations, leveraging all of the assets that we have to bring to bear on closing the opportunity gap.
You want to just jump in here because she talked about the health human services thing, and sort of that integrated model. You touched on it. Do you want to, are there some things that you think we could prioritize right now that would help with that linkage?
Sure, I'm happy to talk. The one thing I did want to tell you, we do have a formal mentoring program, tutoring program where we engage seniors. It's called Inner Ages, and it comes out of the Jewish Council on Aging. That's where the program sits now. So we can fill you in more.
It is integrated into all the
school system.
public school system.
But not all schools, depending on funding, it's how many schools we get to. But there is a program that engages involved and interested seniors.
Great.
In addition to that, I think the whole premise of our department is based on integration, integrating health with human services, recognizing that families, and we're talking about an intergenerational approach, rarely come to us for one need, right? So if someone's coming to us for food stamps, we often find that there are multiple children. There's a childcare need, or there's a housing need, or there's a domestic violence issue going on. Maybe mom's pregnant and doesn't have access to health care, and if you really want to do it right, you want to get to good prenatal care, and then talk about early childhood education and then beyond. So we have several models. The community schools model that exists around the country is essentially about bringing the community into the school environment, because the school sits right at the center of the community. And a lot of our early childhood programs, the universal pre-K, come out of the school, the school classroom for 4-year-olds, and thinking about what do we want to do for 3-year-olds, and what does that community environment look like. And if we're building those connections with school and community and healthcare providers, then it comes out of the department and goes into that neighborhood and truly wrapping around families and children who need those services. And so it is that premise of collaborative practice that drives all of our work and all of the investments, because there's more than just government doing this work. There's a leverage that happens, and you see it in this room. And that's why I think collective impact is such a powerful approach that Montgomery Moving Forward is driving, because it brings so many sectors together to drive the imperative. And I think we are playing a role in this, but we're not the sole drivers of it, which is really very cool.
Jennifer, how about the nonprofit partnership in this sort of collaborative model?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that the cross-sector piece that Uma talked about is incredibly important. And so one of the things that we've been working on is a Washington Regional Early Care and Education Workforce Network, which is a regional initiative. And I think sometimes we get very insular. So I'm Fairfax County resident, I'll admit. I drove here to Montgomery County. I will drive to DC to my office a little bit later. But we are a very transient community and region, and people live, work, and play across state lines every single day. And so how we come together as a region and think about it specifically with the early care and education workforce, where we are asking teachers and providers to improve quality and to get additional credentialing and education, but that may not be portable across the region, across state lines. And at the same time that you're asking to do that, just like all of us, if you get an additional degree or higher education, you assume that there's going to be some sort of a wage increase as a result of that. And we can't put that all on the backs of providers and child care centers to think that they can make both of those things happen. It can't be only about government putting the dollars into that. It has to be a group of partners and stakeholders coming together. And so with this particular workforce network, it is region-wide. So it is Arlington, Fairfax, DC, Montgomery County, and Prince George's County, all working together to really think through what it would look like to do a career pathway that maps competencies to wages. And it's a whole host of key stakeholders around the table. So it's providers, it's government, it's advocates, it's higher education, all who have a stake in the issue and a role to play, and have been incredibly willing to be at that table to talk about how do we work on this together, what is each of our roles, and how do we sort of break down those silos, come together, and map a plan that will be region-wide, but ultimately is going to benefit each of the jurisdictions that are participating in that.
So I'm determined to get this whole agenda on track, so I'm going to wrap it with a final question for everybody so that we can move to our second panel to respond to a lot of your really good ideas here. In my business career, we were pushed, and I'm sure you have this experience, towards MBOs, management business objectives. That was trumped then by WIGs, wildly important goals, because the research shows that if you have 10 business objectives, you will not accomplish very many of them. Whereas if you have 1 to 3 wildly important goals, you will get those things done on an annual basis. So I just want to go right through our panel and say, if we were really trying to move the ball forward, how would Montgomery moving forward prioritize some wildly important goals that would actually create success and results for this next generation, the post-millennial generation that we need to be investing in now and planning for?
I think the strength of the collective impact model and of Montgomery moving forward is that it brings out, the information tends to effervesce as attention is paid. I think we will learn, I think one of the key issues that we need to tackle is what is the universe of programs out there, including programs that live in the private sector that may be somewhat isolated, but that may be producing fantastic results. I mean, we have one at Asbury Methodist Village in which we have intergenerational education opportunities that are happening as we speak. And I think those programs may be or may not be replicable, but definitely lessons can be learned and gleaned from those programs. And I think the collective impact model tends to bring people together that will actually speak about those, will compare and contrast those, and the effectiveness will be measured as we move forward.
Uma, what would be your wildly important goals?
So we've done rather well with government, policymakers, nonprofits talking about this issue. I think we haven't done as well engaging business, and I'm hoping that the economic imperative and the return on investment can be so well articulated that every business in this community recognizes the importance of early childhood and is willing to step up and partner with us to make that happen.
And what can business do that makes this have collective impact, efficiencies, and not just random acts of goodness and partnerships?
Right. If you recognize the workforce imperative, if you have a workforce that is consistent and able to come to work because their children are taken care of, that's in the today. And then if you're taking care of the children, that's the workforce of tomorrow. So from both ends, if we can make that case to business, I think we've done something important. And they will recognize the value of coming to the table. Ultimately, for business, it's about the bottom line, as it should be. And if you don't make that case well, then why on earth would they come to the table? So.
And what does it look like? Daycare centers on site with highly trained daycare providers. Give us some examples of what that might look like.
It's all of the above, right? So it's the ability, it's the flexibility that Discovery talked about, whether it's leave or the ability to drop kids in the morning, pick them up in the afternoon, be able to work from home when your kids are sick, whatever that might be. It might be a childcare on site, or it might be enough accessibility to childcare in a neighborhood, whether it's schools as the centers, it is nonprofits or public childcare. It doesn't matter where the childcare sits, but the accessibility in a community and a neighborhood is important. And then lastly, it's the affordability, right? And that not only are you affording childcare, but that childcare is high quality and that the workforce is well paid, because that's what incents and motivates people, workers, to do a good job with children.
Right. What would be your wildly important goals for the county right now? And all the partners here.
And all the partners here. I think I agree with what's been said around sort of the collective impact sort of strategy and the opportunity that Montgomery moving forward has. You're going to have a strategic plan. I'm sure it's going to talk about these issues of affordability, of access, of quality, of supporting the workforce. So how do you take that plan, keep up a sense of urgency and momentum through a collective impact strategy where we can begin to measure where we are and where we need to get to. And I would just say, the piece to urge is the continued sort of and relentless focus on equity within that plan. There are a lot of information gaps, I think, that still exist in terms of how these programs are currently working and for whom, and what kind of outcomes they're producing and what some of the needs are. And so there is going to be, I think, more work to really fill information gaps, keep bringing different stakeholders to the table that represent these changing demographics, and really grapple with questions, because even within a bold vision, you've got to set some priorities about where do you start and for whom, and who do you prioritize. And I hope Montgomery moving forward will have some of those tough conversations.
Great. And Jennifer, you get the last word.
So ditto to everything that my fellow panelists said. And then on the equity framework, I think the collective impact piece is so critically important. And Montgomery moving forward has the ability to pull stakeholders together to have these important conversations, because everybody has a day job and is incredibly busy, but to take a moment to sort of step outside that and think about the big picture and how you come together and partner is incredibly important. What I want to say is that we don't lose the voice of the people who are impacted the most. And oftentimes we have the best of intentions in the public policies that we put into place, but when you really take into account the lived life of a low-income woman, it doesn't always work. And so I think ensuring that those voices are really at the table, an equal, equitable stakeholder in the conversation is incredibly important.
Great. Thank you so much. Jennifer, Miriam, Uma, and Manny. Thank you.